Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audiences. I'm happy to welcome you to the second installment of ICSID's webinar series, Investment Mediation Insights. As you know, the ICSID member states adopted in 2022 a set of mediation rules customized for investment disputes. The differences to other ICSID frameworks is, among others, that there is no membership requirement to the ICSID Convention, there are no nationality requirements, and parties may institute mediations also without an existing agreement to mediate. The Secretariat can assist in facilitating this agreement by transmitting an offer to mediate. Information on that is available on our website, and we are putting this also in the chat on ICSID's mediation rules, how to file a request, and also our background paper on investment mediation, as well as our treaty analysis on mediation provisions in investment treaties. In this series, I wanted to just highlight 3 webinars that we have recently held. That is one webinar where mediators share success stories that aired on December 3rd, 2025. And we had 2 webinars where we debriefed actual investment mediation with the representatives from the investor, the representatives from the state, and the mediator as well. These mediations happened in 2 regions, one in South America, one in Europe, and we have links in the chat to these 2 webinars as well that may be of interest for our audience. Now, in March of this year, we expanded our series to include also mediation in the context of investment dispute management. And on March 18, we had a webinar featuring speakers highlighting dispute management on the domestic level. Today, I am happy to have with us here Judith Knieper and Priyanka Kher, and we will take an angle on investment dispute management and mediation from the international level. Now, starting with my colleague Priyanka. Priyanka is a senior private sector specialist in the Global Investment Climate Unit of the World Bank Group. She leads advisory and research projects on policy, legal, and regulatory reform, and focuses on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The work focuses on attracting and retaining and benefit of investment for economic development. Priyanka has widely published on the topic. In fact, in our chat before the webinar, we just discussed a publication from 2022 that is particularly helpful in this context we're discussing today. Judith Knieper is legal officer at the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL in Vienna, and she will share with us what Working Group 3 on Investor-State Dispute Settlement Reform is doing in the context on investment dispute management. Prior to joining UNCITRAL, Judith worked in a number of international organizations, and I learned today that apparently a few years ago we were also colleagues when you worked at the World Bank Group. So, in terms of format, we welcome any questions in the chat. We will pick them up as we go or later at the end of our discussion. Now, if we jump right in, Priyanka, may I start with you? Why should states think about investment dispute management and engaging with problems that occur in like investment relations between private entities and a state or a state entity, and doing that before it raises the level of a formal dispute settlement proceeding?
Thanks, Frauke, for having me here today. Pleasure to connect. So when we really at the World Bank, when we started our work on dispute prevention, grievance management, investment retention, all the same things, our rationale really primarily was improving the investment climate and specifically supporting states in better attracting, retaining, and expanding investment. And we know, for example, through several years of investor surveys that the issues that typically generate disputes, arbitrary government actions, issues of expropriation, and so on, are also issues that cause investors to withdraw from an investment location or not expand in the location. And of course, needless to mention, once a dispute is triggered, the investor might continue, might stay, but expansion plans are highly unlikely. So I think the whole idea was to maintain long-term longevity of investment, and a second rationale was, of course, the costs. We know from recent analysis that the cost of responding to a dispute can be sizable, and yeah, addressing these issues earlier on, it really comes at a fraction of a cost through some of these frameworks on such as grievance handling and investment retention mechanisms. So I would say twofold rationale: retention, long-term retention and expansion of investment, and then managing costs.
Thank you. Judith, Working Group 3 focuses on the one hand on formal dispute settlement proceedings, and on the other hand also on dispute management. Can you give us an idea of the status of the Working Group's work?
Yes, thank you, Frauke, and it's a real pleasure to be here again, especially also to be on a panel with Priyanka, as Priyanka and her team contributed a lot to the text I'm going to present today, so it's very timely for us. Working Group 3 was given a broad mandate to work on ISDS reform back in 2017. It was a 3-tier mandate. The first step was to identify concerns, and we did, and Priyanka already mentioned costs, we did identify concerns, cost and duration of the proceedings, consistency and coherence of the outcomes, correctness of arbitral decisions, and independence, impartiality of the decision makers. As a second step, the working group discussed whether we should look at ISDS in general or whether we should only define certain reform elements. And the working group said we should try to look really broadly at everything and develop solutions to reform ISDS in general. And this is then when we move to the first stage, and this is the stage we are currently in, designing solutions. And we started at the very beginning. We had discussions, the working group, which means all states. To every working group session, we do send out 193 invitations to states. To every United Nations member states gets an invitation. We also have 70 member states, but everyone is invited and is asked to contribute to our discussions. So the working group, all these states that followed our invitation, has emphasized right from the beginning that prevention is the most effective form of reforming ISDS. To avoid ISDS and to focus on how one could make sure that disputes are not arising, because every dispute that is not arising is better than any kind of dispute you might have. And we worked on mediation, so we have this mediation model provisions to be included in treaties. We have guidelines for all stakeholders, and we have a third instrument that has been developed, that has been adopted by the Commission last year, which is the UNCITRAL Toolkit on Prevention and Mitigation of International Investment Disputes, to which we shortly refer to the Dispute Prevention Toolkit. And the Dispute Prevention Toolkit is a non-binding text where we try to give states an overview of what others do. So we really try to have a broad overview of practice. It compiles practices from states, from other stakeholders, so also the World Bank, and that's why Priyanka and her team contributed quite a lot, to make sure that we have guidance for states compiled that they could pick and choose to see what would fit for them. It's a non-binding document because we didn't want to create any expectations that investors could rely on, but it's rather really a source of inspiration for states.
And you have quite a variety. There's a large number of states that contributed to the toolkit, if I remember. Can you give us a ballpark?
Yeah, nearly all states that were participating in the working group also did participate. So it's I didn't count now all the different links we have, but it's really
Substantial.
a very substantial overview. And the idea is also that this be a paper that is not carved in stone, but is a living document that is to be continued. We are not there yet who is going to continue, but that could very well be an exercise for the Advisory Center on International Investment disputes on which we are also working currently.
If we now look at investment disputes, they may arise in a variety of economic sectors. They may arise involving a number of different government entities, executive, legislative, or judiciary branches may be involved. So given that we have this wide range of dispute origins, how can conflicts actually be managed before they morph and are translated into a legal dispute and formal notices are sent? Priyanka, what are your thoughts? What's the work that your team has been doing on this?
Sure, sure. So, again, initially when we were beginning technical assistance in the area of grievance management and investment retention, dispute prevention work, we first tried to see, okay, why are these issues arising, right? What is the market failure in our world? And what we realized was really it came down to either coordination failures between agencies for exactly the reasons that you highlighted, and second, information gaps. So basically, you have a typical situation where higher levels of government, ministries of investment and trade, president's office is involved in signing BITs, signing important concessions, investment contracts, making investment laws, drafting, and so on. But the day-to-day interaction with the investors is really at multiple levels, including at subnational level, municipalities, sectoral agencies, and so on. And what's signed up there doesn't really get translated into action. And there is this and that's on account of either weak coordination or information gaps. So I think that part we understood from our initial diagnostics in some of the early engagements. And so then it came to how do we try to address some of these failures? And again, from our experience, number one, of course, creating a formal interagency mechanism. So, and we'll get into this in more detail later in the webinar as well. So really bringing together all the stakeholders, having one agency kind of wear the leadership cap, but bringing together the rest of the involved agencies and stakeholders, number one. Number two, defining things. Of course, everything depends on the context and what resources and capacity are at the country level, but defining to the extent feasible operating procedures that will guide the interactions between the various stakeholders involved. And then number three, which to us really came out as perhaps the most critical element, was the use of data. Starting to use data in conversations on problem solving. And here, what is the issue, its impact, and so on. Again, we'll go into the details of that. But these three features were really, we thought instrumental in moving this forward.
So leadership, interagency coordination, operating procedures with more detail, and then data analysis of where these disputes may originate. Judith, I am very well aware that at the UNCITRAL Secretariat, you are certainly not tasked with recommending any particular model or any particular aspect. But given the work that you have seen and all what has come over your desk, what are approaches that you have seen that is helpful?
maybe to take a step back again, that I think dispute prevention has a lot to do with tidying up, knowing what to which obligations you have, assuring the flow of information between the different entities, making sure that your government officials have a certain knowledge and awareness of when a problem, an issue might arise, where it would be better to maybe speak up or reassure yourself that many cases arise from these very different levels and a lack of communication between the entities and not having clear entities in charge. So it's I would think the whole dispute prevention, and then you can choose what you would like to have. If you have one entity, if you have a coordination body, whatever approach you take. But what is important is that you know what you have, you know your obligations, your government officials know what these obligations are, and you try to sort out problems before they pile up and result in costly disputes. So I think this awareness raising is fundamental, and so is communication that allows that awareness and is ongoing work. You always need to have everyone updated because you have constant changes to your legislation, to needs by investors. So it's really a dynamic environment, and communication and awareness is certainly key.
Okay, thank you for those additional points. So that is a good segue to one aspect that I wanted us to dive a little bit deeper into. And Judith already identified or alluded to certain structures that could be put in place on the state level. So what structures could we have there? Is it the Attorney General's office? Are there different line ministries? Is it a coordination? So on the one hand, what structures are there? And on the other hand, what functions would need to be covered to be effective? Priyanka, can you share with us your thoughts?
Sure. So in terms of structures, we've again seen a wide range, of structures that states have put in. So you, on the one hand, have countries, of course, the classic example of the Korean Kotra Ombudsman, where you have that sort of a independent ombudsman type model, functioning as a dispute prevention, grievance handling agency as well. But very often, and more so perhaps recently, we also have the model where a relatively empowered and strong investment promotion agencies, in some cases also departments within ministries of investment, departments mapped to the president's office, are tasked with grievance handling functions. What's important is, ultimately you have this lead agency to be a secretariat for the grievance handling function. But naturally, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, there is so many stakeholders involved. And so you really need this lead agency to have the right sort of political clout and political cover to be able to bring together all these other stakeholders. And that is one, of course, political endorsement, but in some cases, we've also seen legally these lead agencies being empowered under law. So you have examples of investment laws in several countries where one specific agency is mentioned as a lead agency for grievance handling, and that gives it the legal clout as well. So structurally we've seen these kinds of models. What's important is political and legal support to make it be able to perform its function successfully. Then second, of course, we discussed earlier as well, a set of standard operating procedures to govern all the interactions. which then brings me to the question of, what kind of functions, and these functions should ideally be reflected in your standard operating procedures, right? You want to make a reference to. So the way that we have typically seen success is, number one, you want to gather information on the grievance or issue, the problem, everything about the issue, and in a timely way. So earlier on, what is the issue? Who are the agencies involved? Which is the country, home country? What is the effect of this issue on the economic plans, growth plans of the investor? Staying in the country, expanding to different sectors, operating in some backward, area, or areas which need face specific development challenges, and so on. So really gathering all kinds of information on the investor problem. Then assessing this problem from two lenses. So first lens is, if this issue is not resolved in a timely way, what could be the economic impact of this issue on the investor? Does he have expansion plans, which he's going to then stall because he can't continue with this specific operation? Or his experience hasn't been good in this case, right? Things like that. So from the economic perspective, but then also from the legal perspective, does the home country have a BIT? Could this generate a dispute? Is there a concession involved? What are the terms in the concession? Things like that. So what could be the legal implications of this specific issue? And then based on all of that data, really engaging into what we work together on as well, Frauke, on problem solving, using the right techniques to really engage with the other stakeholders and try to come up with what we've been discussing as sort of interest-based solutions, and really come up with a solution to that problem in a constructive way. And once you have a solution, there is a technical discussion, but we several times see that political authorizations are also needed to solve a problem. But following the problem solving stage, you have the enforcement and implementation of the solution. And that is a relatively long sort of follow-on implementation, hand-holding support that comes to the last stage of the process. So that's how I would think of, structure, and then the types of functions, ideally all of them reflected in any operating procedure that is put together.
Mm-hmm. The legal and political cloud being a really important aspect, and then the way it could be structured, if I hear you right, that it can be adjusted depending on the country structures and needs. You identify information gathering and an assessment of the dispute, and that is one thing that we certainly have seen in the exit background paper, and I know it's also in the UNCITRAL mediation guidelines, that is a really important aspect also later to identify the appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms that might be appropriate. But in this context, we speak about it much earlier at the beginning of the identification of the dispute. And if we look at that, Judith, are there any other functions that come to mind from the work that you have done and that you have seen that have been covered in certain mechanisms?
I mean, the response by Priyanka was quite comprehensive. So I think she really got it all. Maybe if you look at our toolkit, the way we structured it, and that could be a way for states to start looking at the issues, is that we looked at communication with investors first and how that could be organized. Then we looked at coordination among government and governmental and related agencies. And finally, we looked at coordination and cooperation with other governments. So we have a slightly different approach to these issues. What is, I think what one could say is there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on the state. It really depends on the means of the structure, also how they have their legal teams set up. So it's what each state should think of how they could tailor their dispute prevention approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is key, yeah.
One thing that I know from both of your works is that the information gathering is not just limited to one particular dispute, but it also has sort of like a monitoring function. Are there certain areas where perhaps as a government we may need to put more attention, more education, more awareness raising, and perhaps more of a spotlight than in other areas? Judith already started us off with the next question, which is, what are your thoughts on how to implement this in practice so that this mechanism actually becomes operational? Priyanka, would you start us off?
Sure. So, so we discussed in the earlier questions, you have the structure, then you have the functions. And so really on the implementation comes down to, okay, how do you make this successful and how do you sustain this, right? So sort of those two aspects. So for both of these, one is, we mentioned, as hard as we try, and we've seen this in country engagements, the lead agency can try to solve this with all the data and technical, economic, and legal analysis and all of that, has all the good. You still, there are several situations where you have to take it to a political level. So having the right kind of escalation mechanism, whether it is an interagency, interministerial sort of a body, or it is the president's office or some other, with whatever is suitable in the country context. But having that sort of high level authority for implementation and problem solving is critical to ensure success, right? Something one can really turn to, because that's also sort of linked to the point on investor confidence, right? The investor knows that part of this system is really access to this office, which we know stays, functions, and is effective. So having an optimum escalation mechanism is I think critical. The second aspect, which is key for success and implementation, would be the monitoring and tracking. So all of this, you're collecting the data, you're analyzing, you're engaging in problem solving, but sort of one thread through the entire process would be how you're monitoring and tracking your investor issue from the start. So really making sure, when did, and there we've had countries using Excel tools, various kinds of tracking technology tools, all kinds of initiatives to essentially see where is the issue now, setting timelines to ensure that the issue or the grievance is resolved within that time frame. So one is to, of course, ensure follow up and timely resolution of the issue, so it doesn't really escalate into a full blown legal dispute. And the second value of this is really the points that Judith was also alluding to on identifying some of these systemic issues. You're seeing that one particular law which bans certain things is repeatedly being brought up in investor issues. So it's sort of showing a pattern that this is a problem for more than one investor, and it needs a look deeper than just one grievance handling. And so really identifying that issue and elevating it to a systemic issue that then needs a broader investment climate reform on that issue. So kind of, that's another way that this kind of monitoring and tracking helps, because then you're dealing with these systemic issues and hopefully not generating another series of issues stemming from this, the core issue.
And
So, yeah.
by monitoring, you can also identify the impact perhaps of revised legislative instruments or certain actions taken that affect an industry sector, concession agreements in a particular way, and that leads to informed decision making.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, in some cases, we've seen this kind of monitoring also then tie into, PPD platforms, public-private dialogue platforms, feedback loops, where, this kind of information gets fed in, and it leads to a little bit more of an engagement, which can be helpful. Yeah.
Now you led us on to the next topic I wanted to cover is how do investors hear about it? So you mention platforms, monitoring of instances. Any other thoughts on how do investors hear and how to build the faith into the system? Priyanka, why don't you just continue and then we'll give it to Judith.
Sure, San. So, again, in this, for informing the investors and bringing them on, I think one strategy that we found helpful, while in some cases the investment promotion agency might not be the lead agency, but it's certainly an agency which is the voice of the government to the investors. So there is a relationship there, and so leveraging agencies like investment promotion agencies, which talk to the investors on a daily basis, to be able to then go out there and spread information about, disseminate information about existence of this mechanism, and how it can be used, how can be of benefit, some success stories, and all of that to really outreach and sort of reach out to the investor community to tell them about what's available. And then I think clearly for investors, I think results speak louder than words. And so, examples of successful resolution of issues, access to high level escalation bodies, an observation that the processes followed by the grievance mechanism are transparent. There is general information about what's going on. All of these contribute to boosting confidence in the system. And when one investor says something good about an initiative, the others take, more of a note than just
Word
agencies writing
travels
about it.
fast.
Yes, exactly.
Judith, you would like to add something?
No, I mean it's really, and that has been stressed very heavily by the working group in our discussions, that whatever mechanism you have, public portals, focal points, ombuds persons or ombuds offices, it's important for investors to know whom they could turn to get their issue addressed. And it has also been said that it's important for states to get feedback during your monitoring exercise, to get feedback on policy issues. So before changing your policy, hear from the investors what would be the results from the investor's perspective. Do you have some support maybe, or is the contrary the case? And that would allow to have a proper risk assessment once you go for a certain measure. You could still go for the measure, but you just need to make sure that you are prepared for some kind of resistance. And
it provides you with insights of what may be coming from the industry. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So that allows you to help tracking. It's also, so the tracking is not only on past issues, but also what might be looming and what might be upcoming. And I think the second very important point that has been mentioned by the working group is that you need to have someone on board who can decide on the issue. So if you are heard as an investor, but you never get to a decision, the decision is always postponed. You never have the right communication channel to have someone who can then take a decision in the whatever direction, but still you know this is the information you can rely on. And I think that's also very important, that you are not sent from one to another, but to have these clear communication channels. So the communication channels are not only within the government that everyone is informed, but include the investors, so that you really have a very comprehensive communication structure. However you do that, and there are different models, and all of them have their benefits.
And it comes back to the political cloud and the decision making within the entity, government, and then outward to the investor. You mentioned what I think is known as consensual rulemaking, and that is in a number of countries this pre-legislative informations gathering, sometimes actually facilitated by a mediator, which of course we will touch upon mediation in our next portion of this webinar, and that is on the policy level in the dispute prevention. Priyanka, have you seen amicable dispute settlement such as negotiation or mediation as a form of facilitated negotiation being implemented in that context for dispute management?
So yes, so for certainly in the again within the context of grievance management and early stage dispute prevention, we actually have seen quite a number of instruments, and I'd say both at the international level and also at domestic levels. So at the domestic level, there have been instances of countries such as China, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Rwanda, a few countries passing their investment laws with provisions establishing grievance management provisions, that there would be a lead agency which will detect these issues in a timely way and then go about resolving them before it hopefully reaches the stage of disputes. So timely, effective, and timely detection of issues and resolution. So at the domestic law level, mostly in investment laws. And then secondly, at the international level as well, in investment treaties, we've seen some references to such dispute prevention mechanisms, most recently perhaps being AFCFTAs, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreements, investment protocol, which also includes a provision on such prevention mechanisms. So certainly the number of examples is increasing, and I think it only makes sense to include something of this sort in your domestic frameworks and where feasible and relevant also in the international frameworks.
And that includes the amicable settlement or facilitated negotiation. Judith, I know you have done some work in this context as well on the provisions generally on mediation and direct negotiations. Have you seen it also in the context of the toolkit?
Yes, because states agreed that mediation is a very flexible tool that you could use at any stage of the dispute. So before it escalates to arbitration or litigation, during arbitration litigation, or even after you have a decision by the arbitral tribunal or the court. So it's really an instrument that is extremely flexible. And Priyanka mentioned BITs. The issue for mediation in the BITs was, and we did the analysis together with ICSID of the treaties, that while mediation was mentioned or negotiation was mentioned, it was never really explained how to implement, how to start the proceedings. If you look at arbitration clauses, it's very clear you have to send the notice of arbitration, which needs to contain certain information, and then you continue your arbitration. The same never existed for mediation, and that's why we tried to draft these model provisions to really incentivize states and to say, by the way, consider that mediation is an option. Don't jump immediately on arbitration, but try to see whether there is room for mediation. And maybe you want to mediate parts of the dispute and you keep the other part for arbitration litigation. There's no one size fits all. Again, it really depends on the circumstances and the case, but it's a tool that is there at the disposal. So what the working group was urging states to do is to consider that this is a dispute resolution tool at their disposal at any point in time. And this is why it has also been referred to in the dispute prevention toolkit.
Thank you, Judith. May I just stay with you right away. One topic that sometimes comes up in this context is the difference between negotiation authority to participate in either direct negotiations between the parties or facilitated by a mediator. And then separate from that, settlement authority. Who settles, who signs off, who has the final decision, as Priyanka put it earlier. What are your thoughts on that differentiation?
I think what is really key that you have clarity. So whatever you do, whatever authority you give to single government officials to negotiate or to settle, you need to have clarity and you need to have the right people in the room. It doesn't make sense to try to find a settlement if the person who has the authority to conclude the settlement agreement is not in the room. You need to have all those people who have a say in enabling a settlement agreement, you need to have them there. And you need to have clarity from both sides, not only on the side of states, but also on the side of the investors. The investor also need to send those people who have the authority to negotiate or to have the authority to settle. It makes no sense to say it's the CEO who decides and the CEO is not involved in these settlement talks.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you.
that has been made extremely clear. We need to have the right people in the room, and mediation is so flexible that you can be generous. If you are not sure, invite more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the exit mediation rules, in Mediation Rule 20, we have a provision that identifies or invites the parties to identify the process to be followed to implement any settlement that might be reached, in the understanding that perhaps the final settlement authority may not be able to participate, be that in a cabinet decision or an administrative court or otherwise, or an attorney general's office. But at least at the outset, the negotiations are already linked with potential settlement later on. Priyanka, what are your thoughts on this topic? What have you seen? And
Yeah, so again, from the very early grievance management stage, right? We are talking much earlier in our what do we
life
call it?
cycle.
Life cycle, exactly, our life cycle. So from that perspective, we've always found it useful to separate the two a little bit, because at the very earlier stage, when you really have the grievance and the negotiations are in that context, it's very much how do you ensure longevity of the investment, and it's a small issue which needs to be tackled in a relatively hopefully in a relatively technical business context, without already introducing legal provisions and so on. So there is a little bit of comfort, I think, investors feel if you're separating the two, and then also, of course, having the investment promotion agency, which is often positioned as the friend of the investor. It adds a little, some, like I said, some comfort to the process. But needless, so separating the in process of the investment promotion agencies involved as a partner. And then, of course, needless to mention, this goes back to all of our discussion, information sharing and coordination. Whoever is settling, whoever is in the negotiation phase, early negotiation phase, in the settlement phase, there has to be sort of information sharing and coordination and exchange between these agencies on a regular basis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one final questions for the two of you, which is, we talked a lot about the state's party, of what structures can put into place, what function, how can states communicate, engage. And now if we turn our focus on the investor, what can investors do when a problem arises that might be helpful for the dispute management? Judith, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So the working group's opinion was that it always takes two to tango. So you need to have the investor on board as well. And if you look at the decision by UNCITRAL to adopt the dispute prevention toolkit, it clearly says that this toolkit should be used by states, but also by the investors. So the investors should also read the toolkit to know how they could play their part to make sure that disputes do not arise or are settled quickly. Maybe issues are settled quickly. And it's really for the investor to try to also engage early, to not let the issue grow, but to communicate early on, to provide feedback, to respect the local proceedings, to seek the dialogue. And what we saw, many issues are also created because investors try to bypass local remedies, try to escalate prematurely, or using media to make pressure. And then it's really difficult to find a useful situation for both. What both probably want, and Priyanka said that, is the retention of the investment. So attraction of investment, but retention, and potentially have new investments in addition to the retained investment by the same investor. And for that, you really need both to play their role according to the toolkit.
Priyanka, your thoughts?
Yeah, so no, fully agree. I think, first, as Judith mentioned, right, it's really proactively reporting these issues. And I think, and I could have a better phrase, it does take two to tango, because till the investor has to give the system a chance, right? Has to have some faith in kind of giving the system a chance, and for it to sort of play out and then take a decision. So certainly proactive reporting of investor issues to the system, as opposed to directly reaching out to the very highest level political authority to kind of then do like a one-on-one resolution, which we've seen actually in several cases. So if you're doing that, then the system itself is falling apart. There's no one using the system, nobody takes it seriously, and it's not going to really take off. So one is proactive reporting to the system. Second, which is I think perhaps even more important, is supporting on the data gathering process, because the one unique or sort of value add of the system would be how you're leveraging data to resolve a problem. But if you don't have access to complete data and honest data from the investor, there is no way to let the other agencies know what the impact is or how this problem really affects the business. There has to be sort of proactive information sharing, data providing, but also honest data providing to actually enable the lead agency to then view the problem with that lens, and then for the lead agency to be able to communicate that with all the other stakeholders involved, so that a case can be made for the investor within the government. So I think providing this information in a complete and honest way. And third, of course, is again links very much to what Judith was saying, is just constructive engagement and having the right people, and engaging in problem solving with the right approach. So if I think it's in both of the parties' interests, this long-term continuity of the investment in the countries. So really approaching it from that perspective, I think,
From the
is very
mutual
helpful. Yes,
benefit aspect, and it takes two to tango.
that's right.
What a nice way of concluding our webinar, to call on the participants or stakeholders or disputants to look at it in a problem-solving view and contribute towards the common goal, a shared goal of managing the investment dispute. That concludes our episode today. I thank you very much for this insightful discussion. presentations from both of your institutions. And certainly we look forward to welcoming our audience on our next webinar on June 24, where we will dive into negotiations and featuring a government official and a representative of an investor in the mining sector to see how negotiations and facilitated negotiations have taken off. We look forward to welcoming you and thank you again for today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.